sometimes when the gospel touches people in a non-religious environment, something wild can happen. People radically converted on the street, people saying, I will leave everything and follow Jesus.
Welcome everybody, Simon Gilbo here with Inspired, and I'm thrilled that this week we've got an old mate called Steve Lee. Welcome, Steve.
Hello, Simon. Nice to be with you today, mate.
Steve is the founder of Miracle Street. Now, Steve and I go back about a decade. I think you've been on the road 30 plus years, haven't you, Steve? Preaching the gospel, doing street stuff, escapology, crazy escapades in a number of countries, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about. So let's get stuck in. Tell us about your childhood. What were you like?
Well, a bit of a mix, to be quite honest. I grew up with an alcoholic father, so everything was a little bit chaotic for me growing up. I was a dreamer. I was one of these kids who looked out of the window at school. I always felt that I was born to do something, but didn't know what it was. Believed in God, but couldn't work out whether God believed in me or not. So, led me into some interesting situations. I used to light fires quite a lot. I was one of those types of kids. I always believed that something would happen for me down the line, but I was a little bit troubled as a kid, to be quite honest.
Give us a few few vignettes of your early teens or late teens before things really changed.
Yeah, well, one of my very early memories. So what I ended up doing was preaching the gospel on the streets. And I often look back at my childhood and I think, I wonder whether the signs were there. And I remember this situation when I was about 8. I was in Worthing town centre on the south coast of England, where I grew up. And I stood on a dustbin for a bet. Some guy said he would give me £2 if I would shout to the crowd on the street. And there was probably about, 500 to 1,000 people on a busy Saturday morning. And I stood on a bin as a kid, and I talked rubbish. I don't know what it was that I said, but looking back, I ended up back on that same spot when I was 23. And I first preached the gospel in the open air. So, there were a few little signs like that in my childhood as what I would end up doing.
And did you make horrific decisions, or was it just standard rebellious stuff?
Yeah, I wasn't a bad kid. I was a little bit of a weird kid, I have to say, but I did a few things. I nicked a few things in shops and that sort of stuff, but I wasn't particularly aggressive or violent or anything like that. But I was very lost, I think. Probably the relationship with my dad was very difficult. So I ended up making some difficult choices, I think, around friendships. But it all changed for me when God took hold of my life.
So, tell us when that happened and what was the deal there?
Well, throughout my teenage years, I was involved in youth clubs, churches. I really couldn't work out the whole God thing, but I liked being around Christians because they seemed peaceful. They seemed like people who knew who they were, and I didn't know who I was. So that drew me into the church, I would say, more than faith initially. It sounds a strange way round, but I got involved in the church without really believing in God. But everything changed for me around 1920. I was on a trip to the Isle of Wight. I met some people that I'd known for a while, and I found myself in the mix of a worship event. I was quite used to it in some ways, but something happened in that moment where I heard about God in a way that I had never heard God explained before. And I made a radical decision, Simon. I turned the control of my life over to God. I told him that I would do whatever he wanted me to do, and I would be whatever he wanted me to be. And it was just like a light switched on. And I felt that God called me as an evangelist really from day one. I remember taking a walk along the cliff by the sea on a very stormy day, and I imagined the message that I knew had landed inside of me, coming out of me and going to the ends of the earth. And I didn't fully understand what it meant at that time, but looking back, it was the moment when God put his hand on my life.
And so how did you cut your teeth doing that?
Really on the street. I looked at the church and I thought, well, really most of the people who go to church already believe it. So I didn't really know what an evangelist was. I then found out what a street evangelist was, and I thought I definitely don't want to be one of them. You know, there was a group in Worthing who I think were probably brethren, and I'm sure it was all well intentioned, but we were scared stiff of them as kids, and they used to stand and they looked like a firing squad, and they used to shout literally out into, well, I did that once, but it was very judgmental. It was quite intimidating, and I thought I just can't do that. I can't be one of those types of preachers. So I went a different route and I learned how to be a street entertainer. I went to places like the Edinburgh Festival. I ended up performing on the Edinburgh Fringe many years later, but I went to Covent Garden and places like Bath, which is, I know where you're based, and where street entertainers operate. And I sat on the wall and I watched how these guys worked a crowd, and I got into big scale magic tricks on the street and escapes, and I just learned how to draw a crowd, and I was pretty successful in doing that. But the challenge came when I tried to incorporate the gospel into it, and that was the beginning of what became Miracle Street.
So what are some of the sort of crazy stunts you pulled off on the streets then?
Oh, mate. Everything. I mean, I started. I mean, I was a rubbish magician, and I didn't know how to escape out of anything. So I set myself up as a fake escapologist who looked like he could escape but couldn't. So I'd get tied up in chains that I couldn't get out of, and then I would use that as a visual aid to talk about freedom. And then I got a bit better. I learned how to get out of a straitjacket, and I performed that on the street. I've got a 7-foot French guillotine, which is obviously a trick, sawing in half boxes, water tank escape, all of that stuff we've done on the street.
Brilliant. Actually, one of the weirdest weeks of my life, I did a 1-week Christian magicians course, and there were some really quite unusual people there, and I couldn't, sort of one of those ones, do I leave after a day? But I stuck it out. But actually, the biggest thing that came out of that week for me was that actually, magician, the craft of it's incredibly skillful, isn't it? And you can't.
Oh yeah.
You can do a few duff tricks with a fake thumb or whatever, but actually to do it well, it is a real skill. And I ended up totally admiring those slightly odd people. Anyway, you don't seem particularly odd, Steve. But
Well, I've got to say that the duff tricks is probably what I'm about. I mean, I didn't really like the idea of getting into all the dark arts of magic myself. I met a few weirdos as well, I have to say. But
and did you ever get sort of? I mean, I've done some street stuff, and I've been spat at and punched, and I mean, a whole load of stuff. In terms of crowd control and that sort of stuff. Did you get any really negative responses?
Oh, all of that, all and more. Yeah, I mean, some guy took a run at me when I was in a straitjacket in Watford. Literally, the team had to pull him off me. It was pretty scary. I mean, I was fairly confident that I could defend myself if I needed to, but being in a straitjacket with a guy running at you was a challenge.
Yes.
But then what happened is that, I mean, the police were called actually, and this guy was very broken. I sat down with him afterwards and he apologized to me, and basically what had happened is that his wife had been sectioned that morning, and he thought he was going to lose his kids, and he saw me in a straitjacket, and he thought I was mocking his wife, and he obviously was drunk, and I chatted to him. There's been lots of situations like that. I mean, hecklers. I mean, I'm up for all that, really. I've never had a problem with people questioning the legitimacy of my birth, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, there's been some scary moments as well. I mean, I've worked in some of the most volatile council estates in the UK and in Europe as well. So when I was younger, I probably was a lot bolder and braver in those environments. I think you get a bit older and you have kids and stuff. It's not quite so pleasant, but being criticised and being shouted at has never bothered me too much, I have to say.
You mentioned kids, because that's where we overlapped, because it was 2015. Well, we did meet probably another 8 years before that, but it was in 2015 when it kicked off again in Burundi, and my kids had to. Well, they actually came back not because of the violence, but because my 5-year-old Josiah swallowed some popcorn into his lung. And they came back to England. I was like with Lizzie at the time, said we cannot leave because we choose faith over fear, and if we leave, everyone's going to leave out in Burundi in terms of the expat community, as we're kind of seniorish people out there, and so the way the Lord manufactured for the family to leave was that Josiah swallowed some popcorn into his lung. He's breathing like that, so he needed an emergency bronchoscopy, which he couldn't get in the country. So they left. They came out to England. And what I love is that, thousands of people praying and around the world for us. And on the day of his operation, he coughed and out came this popcorn.
No.
And so, even doctors would say that was a miracle. It's 10 days on, and it was just the way the Lord organised for me to be able to stay out there and experience the coup and just not be sort of freaking out about the family and then back in England. But Josiah, Zach, Grace, they ended up at school in the same class. Literally by the next day, they could just rang out this lovely Christian school. Was it called King's in Fair Oak? And the headmistress was it Heather Bowden said, "Yeah, come in the next day." And they started, and that's where my Zach hooked up with your Robbie, isn't it?
Robbie, yeah.
So that was where we linked up again.
Yeah.
Now, backtracking a bit. So you're doing this stuff on the streets. Where does the lovely Lorraine come into things?
Yeah, so a little bit earlier, really. So I was leading an evangelism team in Gerald Coates' church in Cobham in Surrey.
Mm-hmm.
I was part of Pioneer at the time, which was the network that he led, now led by my friend Billy Kennedy. And I was leading this summer team. I was on a year-out training program. This would have been 87, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I met Lorraine. She was a runner. She was a 100-meter sprinter, very high level.
Turns out in the end we were at Loughborough University overlapping there. We discovered that later over at Curry, didn't we?
Yeah, that's right.
Was she England representing?
Yeah. I mean, she was in a lot of national competitions. Yeah, she was in the 3As, the amateur championship. So she knew a lot of people. She was at Loughborough, I think with Steve Backley, the javelin thrower. She was best mates with Diane Modell. She was in that crop in the late 80s. But she was on I think she was injured, and I think she'd just left uni. And she was on this summer team, and I was leading it because I was on the year-long team, and we really clicked. But you know what the rules are with a lot of these Christian things. We never dated or anything like that. But she left a note on my windscreen. It's like something out of a Mills and Boon sort of romance novel, and it got washed away in the rain. So I remember this soggy bit of paper, but she'd written this heartfelt message to me, which she thought I then ignored because I didn't reply or I didn't call or whatever. So then fast forward 3 years, I'd moved to Southampton. She left and got offered a job in industry in Southampton, and we met up and we were married in 8 months, I think. Scared the life out of our parents.
And so that was what year?
So we were married in 91.
And did she know what she was getting herself into?
Well, I think we were both fairly, passionate in terms of what we wanted to go for. So I think she did, actually. She was involved with me on the street and some of the big events that we did outdoors in the early days. But she was quite senior in industry. Then she became an interior designer for John Lewis, and then she became a mum. And she's transitioned through several phases in her own life. She's now leading a parenting training organisation. She works with parents and those who work with children. So we've all, we've always been around kind of communication and, vision and big projects. So, I think we're quite similar in that way.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because your wife or my wife, they sort of hopefully vaguely know what they're going to get. So when I proposed to my wife, Lizzie, I said, "Are you ready to be a young widow?" She knew she had to be ready.
Wow.
It was a dangerous country. England's not a dangerous country, but you're going to stand out. You're going to be exposed to some heavier stuff, aren't you? Has she? So she obviously bought into that, and then the kids come along. Does it look a bit different for when kids come into the equation?
Yeah, I think when I became a dad, my priorities shifted a little bit. I recognised that, if somebody had a go at me on the street, that my kids were affected by that. It wasn't just me. So I don't think I've lost my boldness, but I definitely reshaped what I was doing a little bit, I think, when I became a dad.
Hi folks, I hope you're enjoying all these inspiring stories as much as I am. If you enjoy the podcast, I'd love it if you give us a top quality rating on iTunes so that more people get to hear about it. And if you want to contact me, you can get me on simongilbo.com and the other social media platforms. Now let's get back to the podcast.
So you started Miracle Street, and we want to hear about that. And I picture you on a big sort of like a massive platform that sort of folds out. Was that the focus of it?
Yeah, I mean, I started on the street, as I've said, and then the challenge for me was, how do we lift this off the street into communities? How do we create town-wide and city-wide evangelistic events and projects that have the same feel as being entertaining and gathering crowds, that kind of thing. So that took me into mobile stages. So you're right, I've had a number of vehicles that have been custom made. The big one is an Arctic truck. It's been all over Europe. And Miracle Street, really, I saw the name in a dream. I was wrestling with the idea of, how do we draw a crowd but then engage them in a way that they're already visually connecting with what it might be about. And I saw this banner that said Miracle Street, taking the church to the people, and I made that banner, and I've still got it. This was more than 20 years ago now, but Miracle Street then became a charity. It then became the name that went on the side of the trucks and described a lot of the events that I was doing. And now doing stuff a lot online through the lockdown, it's still Miracle Street, although it's not on the street. A lot of the Old Testament passages about rebuilding streets and places of dwellings. It was really, for me, all about transformation. It wasn't just about the physical place, the physical street. So, yeah, Miracle Street is the name that I've journeyed with now for many years.
And that great big stage platform thing, at one stage we talked about, didn't we, about driving it all the way down to Burundi.
Yeah.
That was a conversation from over a decade ago. But wasn't there a crazy story about how didn't you get it from Canada? Wasn't it?
No, that was a different one. I mean, I've had loads of trucks. I mean, that was a thing called the bandwagon that actually was first used in Fair Oak, that you talked about earlier on with the school, a church that's got lots of people in it that we both know. So, that was four Arctic trailers that sat up in a square under a canvas roof with tiered seating in three sides that pulled out with a forklift. I imported that from Canada. That's another amazing story. But the truck that's got the fold-out platform, that was commissioned by a guy called Oliver Raper, who was Reinhard Bonker's mission director in Africa, and had this vision to build a church without walls. And we ended up taking ownership of it when it was 3 years old.
All right. And go on, give us just a bunch of stories of beautiful, people having encounters and lives transformed.
Well, obviously, for any evangelist, there are stories. And, one story that always sticks in my mind, which was a very powerful one, was when we were in Spain. And we had the truck down there. We went right across the south coast of Spain, and we were in a place called Rota, which is where there's a big American naval base. So it's an unusual town. It's a small Spanish town, but with a massive American element to it as well. And we'd set the truck up down by the beach, and we had 1,000 people around it immediately, lots of young people. We put pop-up goals. We ran a six-a-side football tournament and just preached the gospel every night from the back of the truck, from the side of the truck. And it was a very hot day, and I went and I was staying with a guy who was my interpreter. And I said to him, look, I'm boiling hot. The aircon had packed up. We were in a high-rise block for the week. And I said, look, I'm going to go down to the supermarket and buy a fan. So I went into the supermarket. I picked up this fan, went to the checkout, and I was with Martin, who was translating for me. And this old Spanish lady come up behind me. And she looked at the fan, and she was obviously very poor. She looked very poor. And she said to us in Spanish, where did you get the fan? I need the fan. How much was the fan? And I said 15 euros. And I saw her head drop, and I just felt, go and get the fan, buy the fan. So I went back in and got a second fan, and I gave her the fan, and I just gave it to her at the checkout, and she hugged me in front of all the customers. The checkout girl started crying, and I thought, it's just a fan. I've got 15 euros, and and it was just a moment in the supermarket that we then watched her carry the fan under her arm back into her flat. I thought that was the end of it. That night I was on the truck, and she came. She responded at the front of the meeting, and we prayed for her. The following night, a load of other people came along and said, we've come to hear the American guy who bought the lady the fan. And I said, well, I'm not an American, but it's probably me. And then a load of them came to Christ that evening as well. And that particular evening, I was talking about the story of the woman at the well. And I guess people listen to this, most people will be familiar with that story, that Jesus encountered this lady having walked off piste to have this one-on-one encounter with her, and as a result of that, she goes into the town and says, come and meet someone who told me everything I ever did. And it just resonated with that story. So it was my encounter with her in the supermarket that led to all these other people coming who had heard the story. That for me is a story that I've recounted hundreds of times, because it's just stuck with me as an example of how God can use an encounter with one person to affect many others.
Yeah, beautiful. Just for 15 euros, people. I mean, we can do that. We can do that in Lidl or Aldi, paying the bill for someone behind us. I mean, you hear those stories, don't you? You want to say, come on, it's not that difficult. Let's get more of those stories. All of us, we can have those stories, can't we?
Definitely.
How about in England? What have been your highlights of ministry in England?
Gosh, I mean, picking one or two, Simon, is hard, but there was one guy we were in, it was with the bandwagon that I talked about a moment ago, the 4 trailers we got from Canada. We were in a town in Essex, and there was a South African lad who was only in the town. He'd only been there a day, and he came into the truck, into the venue, this under the tent, and he came forward. He's one of those people that I remember because his response was so dramatic. We came to the end of the meeting. I preached the gospel. I offered the response and invited people to come forward. And this guy just bolted out of his seat. He was on the top row of the tiered seating inside one of the trailers. And he came down into the grass, and he stood in front of me, massive guy, real kind of bodybuilder type guy, and he was crying his eyes out, and he just looked me in the eye, and I prayed for him. And then he told me about his story and how he had been abandoned by his family. He'd found faith in South Africa, but then he'd lost his way, got involved in drugs, and he'd just basically run to the UK. I can't remember the reason why he was there. But he encountered God, and we baptized him in a wheelie bin about 2 months later, and I lost touch with him now. His name was Leon, but that was one of those real kind of raw outdoor, wild conversion stories, and there's been lots of others. I mean, there was a guy I remember leading to Christ in Bognor when we had the big trailer there. And he came up to me at the end, and I'd already prayed for him, and he said, "Can I join?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? Do you join the church?" And he said, "No, I just want to be part of what you're doing. He said, I'll do anything you want me to do. I don't need to be paid. I'll travel. And, and again, I think sometimes when the gospel touches people in a non-religious environment,
Yeah.
something wild can happen. People radically converted, not just making a decision and then, maybe signing up for an Alpha course or whatever. All of that's great, but on the street, people saying, I will leave everything and follow Jesus. And I've seen it. And one or two of those people have joined the team. One guy I know who was a heroin addict, got radically saved, converted, worked with me for a number of years. I was best man at his wedding. So yeah, I mean, many stories, that even talking about two of them like that, it just others flash into my mind. So yeah, I mean, we've reached many people outdoors all over Europe.
Yeah, good to hear. I think a lot of people listening will be, street preachers. In general, there are street preachers that give people a bad name, aren't they? And they give the gospel even a bad name. There's nothing worse than people actually being pushed further away because of people communicating badly. But there is a place, isn't it, for creativity, for being out there. I mean, I found it just over Christmas time, when we were allowed out lockdown, we got out in the streets and we just, everyone likes carols, don't they? So it's just using appropriate tools as and when. So we just sang a carol, then a quick message, sang a carol, quick message, and I ended up talking to this brother-sister combination, Gwen and Zach. And, do you get what this Christmas stuff is all about? And they were like, no. And they were just, you shake the tree. Our friend Scott McNamara says you shake the tree and either the fruit falls and is ready or it doesn't. If it doesn't, there's no point forcing it. Just being sensitive, isn't it? But it was lovely in this case, these two, they both said, yeah, we'd like to join the family right now. And I'm praying for her particularly. She's like, as I prayed for her, she's like, whoa, what's that going on in my heart? My heart is so hot. And I said, Gwen, never forget that for the rest of your life. That is God meeting with you, wanting you to know that you know that you know. And she said, I will never forget that. And I think people are sort of very wary. We're on the back foot in this country, aren't we? And people, we're fearful to be confident of. Yeah. And we're not saying we're any better than anyone else. We are just better off, aren't we? Because we're free from guilt. We've got a new commissioning for the future. We don't need to impress anyone. We know where we're going. We're secure in our status as forgiven and prince or princess. Child of the King, son, daughter of God. I mean, there are so many perks thrown in, aren't there? Being freed of guilt is a massive one. And so, yeah, I mean, you talked earlier about making, mistakes, getting things wrong. Give us some sort of cardinal funny blunders that you look back and think, oh, no.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose I took very big steps and big decisions early on. I live in Southampton, and there's a tough area in Southampton, particularly, that we were invited to do a large event at. We took the trucks in, and it just went badly wrong because we just hadn't done our homework. We hadn't engaged properly. We just rocked up, and we got hit by the youth. About 30 of them rocked up one night, trashed the venue. We made a 999 call to the police 8 times before they rocked up. The crowd dispersed, and and in some ways, I think people blamed the young people for the trouble that they caused. But I learned a massive lesson that night, Simon. I realised that that we were on their turf; it was their patch, and we needed to have with the right to be there. So I now don't just turn up, particularly when we're doing large events. I don't just turn up to a place. We work very closely in partnership with churches.
Yeah, that's good.
We do our homework. We make sure we know what we're going into. So that was one mistake that I learned. It was a big mistake, and we learned from it. But there have been others. I mean, I was doing an event at a place called Temple Newson Park in Leeds, which is a big amphitheatre, and we had an outdoor crowd of about 1,000 people. and I was doing this illusion. Actually, Lorraine, my wife, was doing it with me. It was a packing case, like a substitution illusion, where one person goes in the box in a sack in handcuffs. Someone else stands on the top. The curtain goes up, and you switch places in 3 seconds. And we'd rehearsed it. We'd done this, but I'm inside the box, and I'd been fastened in these handcuffs, and I just couldn't get out of them. And I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. I knew the moment was coming, the curtain was going up, and I knew I had to get out of the box. So I ended up standing on the box with these handcuffs hanging off my wrist, and I felt like I completely messed it up. And of course, everyone was just laughing and whatever. But we turned it around. But there's been lots of times where tricks have gone wrong. I've tried to, escape out of something and failed. I got stuck in a straitjacket in Manchester once and had to be let out of it. So there's a few times where, I've sort of set myself up as some hotshot escapologist and ended up looking like an idiot. But hey, it's all in the pursuit of the ultimate gag, as they say.
That's right. And we talked there of sort of comical mistakes, but how about in 30 years of ministry, in terms of lows, sucker punches, times of feeling disillusioned? Can you speak into that a bit?
Yeah, there has been seasons where I've struggled massively. There was a time where in the early days of Miracle Street, where we didn't have the money to support me, and I was traveling around installing software. I met a guy who actually then helped me to buy the first stage vehicle. He bought it for me brand new. But I did some installation work for him, and I was driving around the country doing stuff and listening to Billy Graham's autobiography in my car. And I just felt like the dream was just dying inside of me. It was a difficult season in my life. And then, I came through that, and then really the beginning of the trucks all came as a result of that. So that was a particularly low time. I got caught in a church split, which again was extremely painful. Ended up relocating into a different town in a different network. So I've tried to be faithful to what I understood as the call of God on my life. But it's not always been easy, and others I'm sure will share that sentiment that you hit blocks in the road and you have to decide whether you want to give up or whether you're going to carry on. And for me, it's been pretty much 34 years unbroken. But there have definitely been bumps in the road for me.
34 years. I mean, that is beautiful. And, in the meantime, almost every week you hear of high profile leaders making spectacular cock-ups, literally sometimes. And it's like, what would you say has been your recipe for staying grounded and keeping faithful to the vision?
I think having the right understanding of who I am. I've always been fairly, almost self-deprecating, because it's not that I feel that I'm worthless, but I feel like I've lived the dream. I feel like, God offered me something and I said yes to it. And it's, I feel quite emotional talking about it. But I never believed that I was worthy of what God offered me. So I've tried to live, I've tried to shape my life around the sense of the enormous gratitude that I have for God, to God, for the way that He saved my life. And I do what I do because I'm grateful, not because I feel that I deserve it. And I think, humility is an essential ingredient for all of us. I think God has kept me humble. Some of the things that I've faced, I think, have been God's way of making sure that I didn't get too ahead of myself. But yeah, I mean, I know what I should have been, and I'm not that because of the grace of God. So that every day I get up and I'm thankful.
That's John Newton, wasn't it? He said, what was it? I'm trying to remember. I'm not what I want to be. I'm not what I ought to be. I'm not what I hope to be. But by the grace of God, I'm not what I was, and I am what
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah.
Good old John
Yeah.
Newton. And I'm
Yeah,
guessing
what a story.
to join you in answering that question is that you've got Lorraine, I've got Lizzie. They are
Yeah.
our loyalist, staunchest allies
Yeah.
and fiercest critics,
Yeah.
and they keep our feet on the ground. Don't let us get away with nonsense.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to have, our wives behind us,
Yeah,
supporting us to the
absolutely.
hilt. And then further people, presumably you got other guys that are just stuck behind you. Have you got people that ask you the tough questions, that don't take any BS, that's like, keep you grounded?
Yeah, I have, and a lot of them are trustees of the charity, people that have walked with me. I mean, Gary Stupple is a great friend of mine,
Good
who is a
buddy.
great friend of yours as well. So he's like a lieutenant for me. He asks me those questions. He doesn't let me get too, ahead of myself or up in myself. And there are others. So I'm grateful for my friends. Years ago, I felt God say to me, "You'll build my kingdom with your friends," and that's been my journey. It's been my story. Very, very faithful friends that have stuck with me and stuck with me,
Yeah.
and have walked the journey by my side, and could have done it on their own, could have had their own ministries in that sense, but worked with me and chose to do that.
Yeah, I mean, one of my life mantras is everything is relationship. And you've lived that as well, haven't you, in terms of get good people around. You don't actually need to know where you're going if you've got good people around you, because it's just going to be good, isn't it?
Yeah,
People got vision and faith, and Lord, you can just direct our paths. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you've done loads of face-to-face over 3 decades plus, but wouldn't you say that actually the effectiveness of your work has multiplied in the last few years, because you've been innovative and an early adopter and entrepreneurial in terms of using media? We're coming into land in the last few minutes, but share a bit on that.
In terms of online and digital, yeah. Well, obviously the lockdown has pushed us all in that direction, but I was very grateful to God to be 3 years into an online journey. I started with Gary's help that I mentioned a moment ago. I started doing this thing called Big Story, which are 5-minute gospel presentations online, often in an historical or even iconic location. I'm very into history. I have a lot of back catalogue of historical stories that I use to illustrate the gospel. So they have literally gone across the world. I've got a background in World War II history, so we've told a lot of those stories and used them to illustrate the gospel. I also do something called God in 60 Seconds. We do 2 a week, so they're 1 minute, obviously, as the name would suggest. Presentations of the gospel as well. I try to be very clear, very direct with all the things that I'm doing. I did an Alpha course in my car called In-Car Alpha last summer, and I'm also now doing a series of evangelistic presentations. I did one called Fire Pit, which was 6 fire stories from the Bible, and I'm now doing one called Watershed, and they're all going to sit under a thing called Elements. So making loads of film all the time, but also speaking into churches. I was live with the leadership team last night. So yeah, I'm doing loads online. But I think this for me is the great challenge. I think online is about content. It's not about church. I'm not sure online church exists. I think it's almost like a misnomer, because the incarnation is stripped away from it. The word became flesh. I think we've got to get the face-to-face thing right at the center of what we are doing. I'm not sure you can disciple someone online, but the online platforms obviously are great and brilliant, and we've certainly, I mean, some of our big stories have been watched over 1 million times. So we've had a huge reach, but but I'm very sobered by the limitations of it.
That's very interesting, because even this podcast can add to someone's discipleship journey. It can be uplifting. That's what we're aiming it to be. But there's no substitute. People, we need to meet together in small groups, in relationship, face to face, and let's get back to that as soon as possible. Listen, any sort of last words? I mean, just mention exactly where people can get in touch with you. But is there anything we've forgotten that you'd really like us to have covered?
Yeah, I mean, there was a story which I didn't say earlier on, which I think has been very important for me, and I'd love to leave this with the folks who are listening to this. Just to say, miraclestreet.com is where people can find me. It's all there, all the videos, all the links are there as well. But the story's this. Gerald Coates, who some people will know, he picked me out in an audience when I was 25, and he stood me in front of this church the church I was in, and he said to me this. He said, "I see the number 9 over you. Something happened to you when you were 9 years old." And I just went pop when he said that, because when I was 9, what had happened is that my father. My mum had found out that my father had been having an affair since I was about 1 year old. And my sister and my sister's 18 months older than me, we stood on the top stair of our house and we listened to this horrendous argument between my parents. And I remember something happening to me, which caused me to shut down at that time. And Gerald prophesied this over me. He said, something happened to you at the age of 9, and he said an internal loss took place, and he said that God took hold of you at that moment, and the internal loss that you felt will lead you to touch thousands of lives. And the reason why I tell that story is because I think it is so important that we recognize that our journey, and sometimes the hard bits of our journey, are able to be redeemed by God, and often are the very things that shape what we become. And that has been so true for me. And I think the empathy that I have for the people who are pushed around, the people who are the back of the queue, I think comes from some of the rejection that I felt, particularly through that period in my life. So it's not easy to go through those times, but and I'm not saying they come from God, but God absolutely uses them.
Well, listen, that's a heavy but precious note to end on, Steve. So thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to say goodbye now.
Really appreciate the conversation this morning, Simon. Lovely to talk to you.
Brilliant. Okay, folks. Well, that was Inspired with Simon Gilbert. This week is with Steve Lee of Miracle Street. Do check that out. And Steve, bless your family, bless the ministry. And we look forward to see where God takes you in the next 34 years or however long he's got for us. Is that too long? I mean, you don't want to be around in 34 years, do you?
Oh, I hope so. I'm only 56.
Okay. All right. So that's at 90. Yeah.
I'll go with that. I'll go with 90.
Okay. All right. Well, see you guys, everybody. See you next week. Toodaloo.
See ya.